In this lesson, we'll learn how to manipulate our perspective grid using the various controls and widgets visible on our artboard. Alright, so in the previous lesson we learned how to enable and define our perspective grid, and we used the define perspective grid dialog here from the view drop-down menu. Now let's say that you need to define your perspective grid, but maybe you want a little more of a visual way to do that. So I'm going to come over here and make sure I have my perspective grid tool selected here, and we're going to do that right here on our artboard. Now there's a lot of different controls here, and you know, it's nothing to be afraid of. We're going to hit on each one of these here, but what you need to know is that the perspective grid tool is the tool that you want to use in order to make changes to your grid itself. Now, if we come over here and we select our perspective selection tool, the second of the two perspective related tools, you can see that several of the controls actually disappear. In fact, all but these three at the bottom. So we need to have the perspective grid tool enabled to make modifications to our grid. So let me hit Shift P and switch back over to that tool here, and let's just go ahead and start talking about this. Now, we've got here our two vanishing points we talked about in the previous lesson, and we've got our horizon line. Now, in the last lesson, we also talked about the ground level line, which is represented by this faint green line here at the very bottom. Now, a good way to kind of see exactly what you can do with each one of these controls is simply to mouse over them. Now you can see here that if we mouse over the ground level line, we're going to get a little four-sided arrow. That indicates that we can actually grab our perspective grid and move it around, adjusting the ground level of the grid, essentially moving the entire grid. So if we come up here and mouse over this little control right here for our horizon line, you can see that we can move this one up and down. We can adjust the height of our horizon line just like so. Now if we mouse over one of our vanishing points, you can see here that the arrows move to right and left. So we can slide our vanishing points along our horizon line just simply by clicking and dragging using our perspective grid tool. Now we can also move these vanishing points out even beyond this little control right here. That control actually will adjust depending on how far you drag the vanishing point. So let me go ahead and just undo that change here. Now let's just kind of work our way in here. Now, we've got some controls, one here, and one right here. These are extent of grid controls. So this control right here is going to control the vertical extent of our grid. You can see that if we mouse over each one of these, we're going to get a little grid icon next to our cursor. So if we drag this one here, you can see that we're raising our grid up, allowing a little more vertical room for our grid. If we grab one of these off to the side, you can see that we actually extend the grid out to the left a little bit further and to the right a little bit further. Now, let's take note here that I drug this control, but it doesn't look like it actually extended our grid. We actually don't see any additional grid lines here. Well, that's because if there's less than 1 pixel between our grid lines, Illustrator's not going to waste time trying to render those out. If we go ahead and just zoom in, let me Control and Spacebar and zoom in on this, you can see the closer we get, the more those grid lines actually get rendered. So those grid lines are there. It's just Illustrator saving some processing power and not trying to render those out when they're that close together. So you can see here that's what the grid extent controls do. Now, I tell you what, we've actually sort of messed up this grid a little bit. Let me just go ahead and switch back over to our default grid. I'm going to come over here to 2-point perspective and choose My Grid. It's going to set it back to our default here. Now, notice here that before this lesson started, I went ahead and increased the opacity just so we could see this a little clearer, and I'll go ahead and do that again just by coming over to Define Grid. Let's bump that back up to about 50% for right now. So we've kind of covered all these controls, and we've worked our way down into this center area. Now, let's go ahead and talk about this little dot right here. Notice that when I mouse over this little dot, we have a little square that appears next to our cursor. This control right here is going to control the actual grid cell size. So if we drag this control up, you can see that we're increasing the size of the cells in our grid. If we drag this little dot down, we're going to decrease the size of the cells in our grid. So however big of a grid you need, you can actually control that on the fly with this little control right here. And that leaves these last 4 controls right here. So let's just go ahead and zoom in on these, and let's talk about this little white dot right here. Now notice when I mouse over that, we have a little white dot that appears next to our cursor. This dot represents the ruler origin for your perspective grid. So we mentioned here that we've got our ruler, and our perspective grid is going to have both an X and a Y coordinates here. So this little dot right here is going to control the 0, 0 point for those two X and Y coordinates. We can actually take this little dot and we can drag that anywhere around our grid. You can see that by default it snaps to the different grid lines. Here we've already established using our grid cell size control. So we can set the 0, 0 point anywhere on our grid. So that's really important, especially if you plan on doing any kind of precise perspective drawings here in Illustrator. Now we've got these last 3 controls here. Now the center one is going to be the horizontal grid plane control. Now remember, the horizontal grid plane is this green grid here. So we can actually, let me just zoom out a little bit. We can control the horizon height by dragging this control up. And you can see here that the distance between our horizon line and our ground level actually decreases. So we can drag that down and increase that as well. So that is the horizontal grid plane control. Now these next 2 are kind of confusing because it's kind of opposite the way you would think it would be, but we have our right plane right here. So we have our right grid plane control on the left side. Now in mousing over that, you can see that the arrows for this one move left and right. So if we drag this to the left, we're going to adjust this plane to the left and drag it back. We're moving that right grid plane again to the right. So we can move that around just like we need to. We can also hold down the Shift key as a keyboard modifier, and we can snap that grid to the different grid lines we've already established here. Just like so. Now, just like that's the right grid plane control right here, we have the left grid plane control over here on the right side. So, and again, that works the exact same way. We can drag that, and we can also hold Shift, and we can adjust the left grid plane right from that control right there. Now, one thing we haven't talked about here with our grid planes is the viewing mode for these. So right now, Illustrator's rendering these out just as a simple grid. Now, if you ever decide that maybe you just don't like the way Illustrator's displaying these, there's 2 other viewing modes you may be interested in. So you can actually access those just by holding down the Alt key and clicking on either one of these grid plane controls. So let's go ahead and just hold down Alt and click on this one. And you can see we also have a viewing mode where Illustrator renders that grid out as a solid filled shape. So we can do that for each one of our grid planes, just like so. We can also come in and Alt-click on these one more time, and Illustrator will actually render those out in a very minimal fashion. So really all we're left with is a basic line. So to be honest, this is completely up to you. It's totally a preferential thing. I personally have gotten used to using the grids themselves, so I usually work just with the basic default grids. Alright, so we've pretty much discussed all these little controls around our artboard here, with the exception of this one right here. This is a really important one if you plan on drawing anything at all in perspective here in Illustrator. This is called your plane switching widget. So basically you have to tell Illustrator which one of these 3 planes you want to be the active plane. Right now you can see that this left plane is colored blue, so that is our active plane. We can switch and make the right plane our active plane just simply by clicking on the right side of that little cube right there. And you can see here that it highlights that side in orange. And likewise, we can go ahead and click on the horizontal plane and it highlights that one in green. So it's picking up on whatever colors you've defined for the different planes in your perspective grid. Now, notice here that we also can mouse over and highlight the area around our cube. If we go ahead and click on that here, it's going to activate none of our planes. That means if we draw objects with no active planes selected, they're going to be normal flat objects here in Illustrator, just like you would have drawn before you even knew about Illustrator perspective drawing. Now we also here within this plane switching widget have a little X in the top left corner. Now if we click on that little X, it's actually going to completely hide our grid itself. Now you have to click right on that X, but you can see that it hides our perspective grid and we can't see it. So let me just go ahead and bring that back with a Control-Shift-I. And if I really wanted to, I could come over here to View Perspective Grid and choose this option right here if I wanted to go through the menus and bring that grid back. So we also have the ability to hide just this widget or move this widget around our workspace. So in order to access that control, we just double click on either one of our perspective tools and we get to this perspective grid options dialog. So you have here an option that we can show our active plane widget. We can actually uncheck that if we don't want to show that, or we can move its position from top left to top right to bottom left and bottom right here. Now we do have some automatic plane positioning options here. We're going to talk about those in an upcoming lesson, so we'll skip over those for right now. Let me just cancel this out. Now, there's one other thing about this plane switching widget that I want to talk to you about that's really important. Now, you may have noticed when I was mousing over the different parts of it that some tooltips came up, and there's actually keyboard shortcuts for cycling between the different planes as your active plane. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you those now. The keyboard shortcuts are the numbers on the top of your keyboard, 1 through 4, and the number 1 is going to activate your left grid plane as the active plane. Keyboard shortcut number 2 is the number 2 key, and it's actually going to activate your horizontal grid plane as the active plane. And the 3 key is going to activate the right grid plane as your active plane. Now there's one other key there, there's the 4 key, and that's going to activate none of your planes, so it's going to switch to no active plane. So those keyboard shortcuts are really important because as we begin looking at some different workflows for creating artwork in Perspektif, we're going to begin integrating those keyboard shortcuts into the way that we work with our artwork and we actually move that artwork around. So I would go ahead and commit those to memory. So, all right. In this lesson, we've learned how to manipulate our grid based on these little controls and widgets we see here in our workspace. In the next lesson, we'll pick up where we're leaving off here, and we'll look at some basic workflows for creating artwork in Perspektif, as well as how to transform objects in Perspektif.